Hey everyone, in this week's content area, we're going to be focusing on supporting materials and ensuring that all of the speeches that you're writing have the materials and the evidence that they need to support the claims that you're going to be making. So whether it's an informative speech or you're motivating an audience or you're trying to persuade them to do something, it's going to be so important that each of your claims is really well supported and has strong contextual reasoning. So let's dive right in and let's actually first begin by taking a look at the types of various supporting materials that you might consider using or integrating in your various speeches. So here on the slide, you can see we've outlined some of the topics that we're going to go over in this video lecture. So you have facts and statistics, you have testimony, which are also known as examples, and then we'll also talk a little bit about stories. So one of the things I want you to consider as you're preparing your speech is beginning to think about what type of speech are you giving, right? What type of audience do you believe you're presenting to? In other words, do you think that they already agree with you? Do you think that they disagree with you? Do you think that they're educated on the topic? Do you think that maybe they've never heard of the topic before? Because a lot of those factors are going to play in to what types of evidence you should be leaning on. For example, if you have an audience that maybe has not heard a lot about the topic that you're going to present on, bringing them a strong sense of fact and statistics is going to be really important to give them a baseline or a foundation by which they can understand the topic better, so that when you make appeals to them, they hopefully can synthesize that information based on what you have taught them. On the other hand, let's say you're presenting a speech in which you think the audience not only agrees with you, but they're very familiar with it. Maybe you're trying to motivate or engage them to take the next step to action, to behave in the manner that you want them to. Now, all of a sudden, maybe you want to kind of focus more on testimony, examples, stories. Maybe you want to lean on more of an emotional approach to your supporting material. So those factors can play a really big role. I would say that for the majority of speeches in this course, for the considerations, for your outlines, and as you're putting together a strong start to finish speech, having great balance will make a really big difference. And when you think about your overall credibility as a speaker, one of the things that you want to do, right, is you really want to be pulling information from strong sources. And so you're also going to want to spend some time thinking about what will my audience relate to in regards to certain sources. So when you go out and you start thinking about who's somebody that I could pull a story or a piece of testimony from, where should I gather my facts or statistics from, it'll be really important that your audience also appreciates those outlets and they regard those as being credible. So let's dive right in. Let's start with the first one, and those are facts. Now, these are what we consider to be verifiable truths, okay? So one of the things that's important about that is that it's verifiable, that it can be tested, it can be surmised, and then followed up on to determine if what you're presenting to be a fact is actually the case. Now, that would be contrasted by your opinion, okay? So you may want to juxtapose the facts that you're presenting with your opinion. So if you were trying to convince us that one type of food, one type of restaurant was better than another, if you were trying to convince us that a certain travel location is easier to access, is cheaper, is more fun, etc., those would be potentially your opinions. Now, you might back them up with something, for example, as saying how close the resort is to the airport, or you might compare it with prices of other resorts on the island, for example, and showcase that it's consistently cheaper. But your opinion would be different than the actual facts that you'd be using to support the claims that you are making. Now, facts typically should be considered dispassionate in nature. In other words, right, we are presenting the facts as they are. We're presenting them from a relatively objective standpoint, and we're hopefully allowing the audience to, again, synthesize those materials and think about them and make sense of them in a way that they can understand, and hopefully that they can refer back to either later on in the speech or after the speech is over. They can think back about the facts that you shared with them and go, okay, I learned something about this particular element, this particular topic, and I can now refer to it later on in life. Okay, next, we are also thinking about statistics, right? And again, when we think about objectivity, we hope that we think about statistics, but that's not always the case. Let's talk a little bit about that, all right? Statistics are going to be primarily quantitative assessments, okay? And you have two types of statistics. So as you see here on the slide, you have descriptive statistics and you have inferential statistics. So descriptive statistics would be your means and your standard deviations, your averages, your modes, right? And so we often see those thrown around quite a bit in the media, right? We see news reporters using them to talk about maybe changing trends within the healthcare industry or within the business industry. But then we also have inferential statistics. Inferential statistics are typically what you're going to see more of in those corporate white papers. You're going to see those in your scholarly journals. And the inferential statistic is going to be a more advanced type of statistic where you're taking the overall averages from your sample, and then you're beginning to infer something from that data. When I think about the concept of inferring, right, I like to think about my ability to infer what might happen to make a prediction. And so in many ways, when we think about inferential statistics, I want you to think about using data to extract some knowledge, to be able to draw some conclusion that you then could apply to some other future phenomena. Now, when you're going through and you're extracting these statistics to support your arguments and to support your claims, be sure to recognize if you're relying on an inferential statistic, say from a scholarly journal, from a set of researchers, that you acknowledge, right, they drew their conclusions based on a set of inferential statistics. So they may have run regressions, right? They may have done some causal modeling, for example, and that allowed them to infer that these are likely the things that took place in regards to that phenomena. If you're going to use their conclusion and say it was backed up by statistics, you should make mention of the fact that they were inferential statistics. Now, taking a deeper look into statistics, the other thing that matter is where are they coming from? So you know likely that you can twist and turn a variety of data points to hopefully support the particular narrative that you're trying to put forth. So there is sometimes not that much difference with what has been published, right? So I want you to recognize, was there a funding source, right? So when you read the articles, right, who paid for the research to be done? Was it a private sponsor? Was it a corporate sponsor? Was it a government sponsor? Was it a nonprofit sponsor? Would that have an influence on what they found or didn't find in the data? Certainly, you could draw your own inferences as to how that could potentially be the case. And then you also want to think about how new or fresh the data is, right? So we want to rely on some relatively contemporary data when we're making arguments to our peers, okay? Yes, sure, there's lots of great studies from the 40s and 50s and 60s, but if I'm trying to convince you to do something today and I want to base that off of modern science and I want to use contemporary statistics, then the journal articles that I'm pulling from, right, they should be relatively new. And when I say relatively new, I'm thinking within the last 5 years, okay? Maybe we can go back as far as 10 years, but if you think about the amount of things that have changed just in your lifetime alone, right, that could be a tremendous evolution or paradigm shift in the phenomena. So therefore, let's look for credible sources from statistics, and let's also go ahead and try to pull and rely on more contemporary information when possible. Okay, now we're kind of going to shift gears here a little bit, right? So we talk about facts and statistics. We think of them as being very objective, okay? Testimony, right? We may or may not think of it as being objective. Now, I want you to use credible, objective supporting materials for your speeches. Now, with that being said, testimony can come from primarily two different types of sources, okay? When you think about testimony, likely what comes into mind for you, right, are maybe scenes of a courtroom, right, where you have a key witness on the stand, right, and they're providing testimony, and that testimony is simply their accounts of what took place in a given event, okay? Now, you may also sometimes in those cases see the attorneys, they will call to the stand an expert, and that expert will provide testimony maybe on how the DNA was extracted or how the DNA was analyzed, or maybe explaining what the procedures are for some scientific method in regards to the case. So when you think about testimony, you can utilize it from two different sources. One being that expert piece of testimony, right? Somebody with a degree, somebody with an advanced or sophisticated knowledge of a particular topic, somebody who has done extensive work or research in a field for a number of years, right? They have value, theoretically, in terms of giving us some information on a particular topic. Now, again, if you're going to use expert testimony, really critical that you give us some understanding as to why you believe this person has credibility. So when you introduce the testimony in your speech, you're going to tell us who it's from. You're going to tell us when they provided the testimony, if they didn't provide it directly to you for the speech. And you're also going to give us some sort of summary. You're going to synthesize, this person should be considered an expert in this area because, and then you'll go ahead and provide us some information that would backfill and allow us as an audience to go, okay, I understand why you might have brought that person in. On the other hand, you might sometimes consider to rely on what they consider to be lay testimony. So that might be a situation where you or I, maybe we have an experience, right? We were witness to something, we've gone through something, right? Something's happened to us in our personal lives that if you came and asked me about something that happened to me, could I give you some testimony as to how it influenced me and how it made me feel and the changes that I made in my life as a byproduct of it, right? Those would be cases where lay testimony would be appropriate. Now, chances are for an informative speech, you're not going to want to include lay testimony. And in fact, I would even argue that in most cases, I would avoid expert testimony in an informative speech. Once we get to something like social activism, or we get to a persuasive speech, when I'm trying to change your attitudes and your opinions and eventually your behavior, you providing testimony to me that I can relate to. So if I can assimilate in some way with the audience and what they're saying, but if I can also help them connect, right, to what is important to them, to people, to audiences, to communities, groups, etc., to what is important to them, that is going to be a really effective way of persuading them. So I would think about testimony as being that key piece of evidence that you can rely on once you've gotten me to kind of lean in and to listen and be interested, and you're thinking to yourself, all right, I'm here. Is there anybody out there who knows more about this than you do or I do? And you bring that person in as your expert and you say, okay, listen to what they have to say on the topic. That can be really effective. All right. I do want to make note before we transition and go any further here that in your speeches, you should be providing oral citations, or what I like to call in-speech citations. And what that means ultimately is that as you're moving through your content, right, as you're working towards being fluid and being able to transition from one piece of information to another piece of supporting evidence, you should be able to tell me where that information came from. So far too often, we'll hear speakers, they'll present statistics, we'll see content on a slide, we'll see quotes around something, and there'll be no credit given to who the source for that information is. So it's really simple, right? You could say, you know, according to Dr. McGloin, a piece of research that he published in 2020, there are certain ways that you should go about integrating technology into your organization to be more effective. And the three things that they talked about were making sure that there's space, making sure that there's training, and making sure that there's follow-up, right? So when you list those things that were cited in the study, you've given credit to the researchers and you've given credit to when it came from. You may want to go a step further in some cases if it was from a magazine article or maybe a blog from a website. You may want to tell us what the magazine or the article or the blog title was. So give us some context as to where you're pulling the information from. If you don't provide it, it's as if you didn't present it, or even worse, you're trying to attribute something to yourself that actually isn't yours, right? So unless you went out and did this study, unless you wrote the article, unless you are the expert providing the testimony on that topic, you should always have some reference to where you're getting your supporting materials from. That's absolutely critical, right? It bolsters your credibility. And one of the things to think about here is use these citations as a way to help your own credibility. So what I mean by that is that if you're speaking about a topic that you have not done extensive research on, right? You haven't been in the field for 15 or 20 years, and maybe you're just starting to get interested in it, but you're going to make a presentation. You want to associate yourself with the folks in the field, with the groups, the organizations in the field that are seen as being the most credible. So by pulling them into the speech and by saying, according to such and such, in the last year, we have seen an increase in this particular thing, and they publish this data in the journal of such and such, you've now taken all of their credibility and you've put it behind your presentation. And that's just absolutely critical, especially as a young scholar or somebody emerging in their career, right? You might not have all the answers to the experience. So associate yourself in your presentations with those who do. And it's a really effective way of integrating a lot of great content and doing it in a manner with purpose as well. Okay, finally, I just want to talk about the fact that sometimes pieces of supporting material, especially in real life, right, especially in conversations, we use stories all the time to try to convince our friends and families about a TV show that we watched or a book that we really enjoyed, a podcast that we love to listen to. And then we go one step further, right? We think about places that we've been, we think about things that we've enjoyed, sports that we like to watch, et cetera, and we begin to tell stories about what these things mean to us. And we hope that the audience will be able to relate to our story, and they might say, you know, we have a lot of things in common. And if you like that, then I might like that too. Now, for the sake of putting a formal speech together, there's typically not a lot of time that you want to carve out to dedicate to your story. But there are a few occasions. For example, maybe taking 30 seconds at the introduction or at the conclusion to wrap up with a quick little story that can be a nice piece to make a personal impression, to make a little connection with your audience, to let them know a little bit more about who you are. Recall that public speaking and audience analysis is all about reducing uncertainty, right? So you want to provide enough information to your audience that they feel like they know you, that they can trust you, that they'll listen to you. And so one of the ways that you can do that is you can tell a brief little story at the beginning or at the end, and that might be something that helps them to connect a little bit more effectively with you. So with that being said, just take for a second and recognize that a story, a great story, like many of the stories that you consume, right? So if you're an avid book reader, if you like novels, if you like to watch movies, television shows, whatever, they typically follow a pretty basic story arc that you can see here on the slide. And the idea is the story begins with some ordinary reality, something happens, and then there's this new reality. So what I would invite you to do and to think about is that when you're telling your stories, try to get to that changing reality piece as soon as you can, right? So, you know, I was a student and I was taking this class, and then this thing happened to me and it enlightened me and it changed my perspective on the world. And then I went off to go pursue this other thing. And that's why I'm telling you about this topic today, right? So find a way that you can weave in some really short, quick stories, and they're going to make a huge difference in helping your audience feel as if that they can really connect with you. So that is essentially, kind of in summary, a lot of different ways that you can support your main points. Here's what's going to be important, and here's kind of one of the takeaways that I want you to think about as we wrap up on this section. You want to have a diversity of supporting materials. So as you're outlining your speech, I want you to identify places to have some facts, some places for statistics, one piece of testimony, and of course, one story, right? So if you have the speech scripted in a way where you have a nice diversity of these supporting materials, one of the things it does is it's going to allow you to have greater reach with your audience. So what I mean by that, right? Think back to what we started this conversation with, and that was think about where your audience is coming into this speech, right? Do they agree or do they disagree, right? Are they highly motivated? Are they disengaged? Do they know you or do they not know you? Well, chances are, as your audience in your life, as they tend to grow and they get larger, as you encounter new audiences and new business opportunities and your career advances, you will at times be presenting to rooms and audiences of people where some will know you and some won't, and some will agree with you and some won't. So by having this diversity of supporting material, what it's going to allow you to do is ensure that you have an opportunity to try to engage, inform, or sometimes even persuade every member of that audience. It'll make for a more compelling speech. It'll make it a lot more interesting. And I think it'll make it a lot more fun for you preparing a particular speech or presentation that doesn't just have one type of material, but it's got a variety of material. So best of luck putting together your supporting materials, and we'll see you again soon.